Hello, welcome to School's Not Out, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE students. You can watch this lesson real-time on Television Jamaica's YouTube channel or on onespotmedia.com. We're also live on Music 99 and gojamaica.com. If you have any questions concerning today's subject, CSEC Biology, you can send them into Television Jamaica's Facebook page or Instagram at television_Jamaica. For today, I'm your presenter, Pierce Lawrence. Let us begin. Now, I remember growing up and there was this song that we always sung. And it went like, there is just one you, not 20, not 10, not 2. You can search the whole world through and still only find one you. And when we think about uniqueness and individuality, it stems from the topics that we've been doing about a few weeks back, which is genetics. And we're going to isolate a key terminology in biology that we use that is referred to as variation. So today our topic is variation and speciation, and we're going to be going based on the objectives as outlined by our syllabus. Now, for today, our specific objectives, we will explain how genetic variation arises. We will explain why genetic variation is important. We will also distinguish between continuous and discontinuous variation in populations. And if time permits, we are going to define what is a species and describe how new species are formed. So let us begin. Now, in this image, what we see is several flowers, and we are to ask, which of the following flowers is an hibiscus? Now, persons will say, probably it's the red one, the one with the red petals, because that's the one that we're most used to in our context. But what I can say is all of these are different variations of the hibiscus plant. Let's look at this image. Now we're seeing some individuals lining up. We see someone that we could describe as being tall. We see someone who we can describe as being short, and we find in-betweens. We find someone who is slim, and on the other side of the spectrum, we find someone who might be described as fat or big-boned. So even within the population or as humankind, we've recognized that there is also variation that's taking place, that uniqueness, that individuality that we sung about in the song when we were growing up in Sunday school. So what is genetic variation? Our literature will describe genetic variation as different organisms in the same species that are not necessarily similar, or they might not be the same, we'll say, but they are similar, but they're not the same, and as such, there is differences between them. So we're going to underline some of the key terms from our definition, or some of the key aspects. So we're saying, yes, it's different organisms. We're saying they are the same species, and we say that there are differences between them. Now, this difference is what we refer to as variation in biology. So when you look at that image, and we don't need to go into topical issues like race, but at face value, when we look at individuals, we can say that each person is quite unique, each person is different. Now, genetic variation is a term that is used to describe also variation in the DNA sequence of our genome. And even though for the human genome, there are several possible sequences that we have, all of the possible combinations are constantly different from one individual to the next. Now, this variation is what makes us unique in terms of our hair color, in terms of our height, in terms of even the shape of our face. And we would have learned that when we were doing genetic cross in a previous lesson. Let's look at this image. We see a pair of twins, and someone will say, all right, but what happens in the case of our monozygote twins or identical twins? Are they really genetically variable from each other? And we'll say, in truth and in fact, in those cases for identical twins, because it's one egg and one sperm that combines together and later it splits to give you two zygotes, they actually have the same genetic information. However, we can find that there are also differences in how these are expressed. So, individuals of a species would have similar characteristics, but they are rarely identical. In the case of identical twins, even though they will share the same DNA, what we have found is that there are slight differences between them, even though it might not be obvious. As you can see in the picture, someone at face value can say, all right, we can see the twin on the right. He has a face that is rounder relative to his brother, who has a face that is more elongated. So we can see, even though they have the same genetic information, that there could be difference in what we term as their phenotypes. So remember those terminologies that we did in a previous lesson. There are differences in their phenotypic expression, or what we see. But how does this arise? This is because for genetic variation, it can come as a result of two factors. The first one is that it arises based on our genetics, what makes us up, our DNA sequence. And then it can also arise as a result of the environment. So environment does play a key role on our expression of those genes as well. Or it could be a combination of two, where it could be your genetics and your environment. Now, even though the environment plays a key role, it is very imperative to note that in most cases, it is our gene that does or controls most of the expression, because our genes is what depicts the type of proteins that are produced on a day-to-day basis. So how does genetics or our genes result in variation? This is done by two ways. The first is through sexual reproduction. And what we say is that for sexual reproduction, remember, we have an egg from the mother and we have the sperm from the father, and they combine together. And those two entities will give you the chromosomes that will make you unique. We'll also recognize that in sexual reproduction, there are additional things that come into place, because for our gametes, they are formed by the process what we call meiosis. And in meiosis, we have the interchanging of genetic information by the chromosomes. And this interchanging of the genetic information in the chromosomes is what also results in variation. Also in meiosis, which is the cell division process, we also have independent assortment. So at any point, you can get one characteristic or you can get another. And this is why you don't look exactly the same as your parents. And we did that when we were doing pattern of inheritance, and we showed it numerous amount of times with our Punnett square. Another way in which we can get genetic variation is through what we refer to as genetic mutation. Now, for the human genome, what we find is that on average, each person will share somewhat a similar sequence. So what we recognize for person one, remember from our previous lesson, we said that there are A, there's a T, there's a C, and there's a G. And these are our bases. Now, A is always bonded with a T and C is bonded with a G. And if we were to say what it is, adenine is bonded with thymine and cytosine with guanine. So for A and T, notice for person one, there are 3 A's in his genetic sequence, and then there is 3 T's. Now for person two, what we find is that the third A is replaced with a T. So it is somewhat inverted. So notice person A had person one had AAA, person two had AAT, so it's different. But in this case, it might not affect more so the expression of what we're seeing, because they still have an A and a T in the third position. Another mutation could arise in that for person three, we have a C that is formed instead. So this is a complete difference. So in the third position, versus unlike what we had for persons 1 and 2, where it was an A and a T, for person 3, we're seeing it's a C, which would mean that the combination in their DNA sequence is now going to be cytosine and guanine. Now this will automatically affect the type of proteins that are going to be formed. And this is one of the examples of what results in, say, something like a sickle cell anemia, where it could be just a simple change in the genetic sequence of the organism that results in someone getting sickle cell disease or causing their red blood cell not to have that normal round shape versus having a sickled shape. So genetic mutation also results in variation. How does the environment result in variation? Let's see. Now, for twin studies, what we find in sciences is that we tend to use twins to investigate genetic variation. Reason being, because we're saying for our maternal twins, because they're identical in their genetic content, we want to find out if they have the same genetic content, how is it that one twin might be different from another in their personality, in probably the way in which they look. And for that reason, we tend to use our twins in genetic studies. So let's look at this image. We have Jennifer and Karen. Probably not the ideal twin names because they don't sound alike, but Jennifer and Karen are identical twins. They're born with the same gene, and of course we're going to see how their lifestyle is going to affect how they will appear later on. So for Jennifer, she eats healthy, low-fat food, so she's a vegetarian. Now for Karen, on the other hand, she eats a lot of fatty, unhealthy food. So, you know, she on a regular basis, she's at all the fast food institutions. Over a period of time, what we found is that for Jennifer, she was not on the bigger side and she was not suffering from obesity. But for Karen, due to her lifestyle and the environment that she has exposed her body to, she now activates that obesity gene and it is now triggered. So in this case, we're recognizing that even though they are the same thing, ladies and gentlemen, students, that we find that they can have differences in the way in which they look. And this is how variation is affected by the environment. Another way, say for example, is when we have someone who migrates. And you know, when they leave Jamaica, they have that standard Caribbean sound. And by you call them a month or two, you recognize they're like, hi, how are you doing? You know, they start to have that accent, they take up the accent. Because just in the way in which we speak, you know, we say them start twang, but just in the way in which we speak, you recognize that something like that or an expression in that way is also something that is different based on the environment that we're in. Or skin color could also be something that results in by the environment. So someone who is staying inside or probably not getting direct exposure to sunlight might be on the lighter side or not as tan versus someone who is getting direct exposure to sunlight on a day-to-day basis. So environment plays a typical role in the way in which we look. Another example could be, say for example, we have persons who are born in a family where there are tall persons, but you're not supplying your body with the necessary nutrients that it needs to produce adequate growth hormones. What you might find is that there might be stunted growth within that individual, and as such you might not be as tall as your other siblings because your diet is not replacing your body with the necessary nutrients to get you as tall or to grow as fast as your other siblings. Now, we also see that in other organisms. So let's take, for example, for plants. When in the picture, we see two plants, one that is grown in the sun versus one that is grown in a shaded environment. And for the one that is grown in a shaded environment, even though that they might be the same plant sharing the same genetic information, what we find is that the one that is growing in the shade might suffer from what we call chlorosis. So the leaves start to go yellow or have a lighter green color based on the fact that it is not getting direct exposure to sunlight versus the one that is out in the sun. So it's not just something that we see within the human population, but any animal, any plant, any kingdom, what we'll say, we can find organisms that show some amount of variation. What are the different types of variation that we have? We say variation is divided into two categories. We have what is called discontinuous variation. Now for discontinuous variation, this is where the individual falls in a number of distinct classes or category based on a feature that cannot be measured across a complete range. Sounds a little bit complicated. Let's simplify it. We're saying for discontinuous variation, you either have that characteristic or you don't. So when we look at blood types, someone might have a type A blood, but another person has type B, another category. Another person might have type AB versus another person who has type O blood type. So there are distinct categories when we speak about discontinuous variation. So remember, distinct, discontinuous. For continuous variation, on the other hand, which is our second category, what we find is that there are not necessarily complete categories or specific categories because there are probably measurements that are taken into consideration. So let's look at height. Even though we say that someone is tall or short, it is very relative to someone who you're standing against. So let's look at this image here. We have two persons. We have person, look like the same person, but we have person A, person B. If I were to ask, who is taller? Persons will say the person who comes second because he looks a little bit higher. But if we were to add a few more persons to the mix, who is taller? It becomes more relative. Then we say, who is taller again? Even more relative to the next person. If we were to even ask, what is your specific height? Someone might say, I am 5'5", while another person will say, I am 6'2". But what defines what is 5'5" tall? It's tall relative to someone who is probably 4 feet. But if you're standing beside someone who is 6 feet, you might not be considered as tall. So of course, for continuous variation, there are no distinct categories in the way in which we categorize things based on the massive components to take into consideration. Now, if we were to distinguish between the two, and this could be, say, for example, an essay type question that the examiner could ask you to distinguish between various or discontinuous and continuous variation. And some of these are the key points that we will look at. For discontinuous variation, we say it deals with a few clear-cut phenotypes. So, say, for example, when we're doing with blood type, there are clear blood types that you must have. Versus continuous, that deals with a spectrum of phenotypes and it ranges from one extreme to another. So even with height, persons who are suffering from dwarfism, they might be below 4 feet, but compared to another person who is also suffering from dwarfism, they might be relatively tall. For discontinuous variation versus continuous variation, we say discontinuous is controlled by a few genes. So for blood type, we're saying that the alleles that we do is A, B, O. There are only 3 alleles that can give you a specific blood type. And I would suggest if you don't remember these, review our previous lesson. However, for continuous variation, there are many genes that come into play. So in order to give you your height, there might be a gene that needs to produce growth hormone. There might be a gene that needs to take into consideration the way in which your bone structure is building on a regular basis. And it's not just, we can't say it's just one specific thing or one specific letter like what we've been doing before, but it could be several genes across numerous amount of chromosomes that will give you your characteristic. For discontinuous, another difference is that genes do not show additive effects. So if you have the gene, that's what it's going to possess. However, for continuous, the genes could show additive effects. For example, the more darker gene, the more darker the person will be in skin color. So it is relative and we say it could be changed. And this could be supported by our final difference in that for discontinuous, it's not modified by environmental changes. So no matter where in the world you go, students, you will always have a blood type A if that is what your genes depict. However, say for example, for you travel, as we highlighted in the previous scenario, it might definitely change. So for continuous variation, these are modified by environmental conditions. And we looked at our skin tone as one of the major examples. Let's also look at how we could represent these two types of variation using our graphs. So what we find is that for our discontinuous variation, we tend to get a nice bar graph that shows the percentage of persons who are suffering from blood type. And for our categories that are on our x-axis, what you notice is that you have AB, A, O, B. So there are distinct categories that we're seeing, and we place the amount of persons in a population. So if we were to do our census in Jamaica to find out, the blood bank wants to find out how many persons in Jamaica are suffering or who have a particular blood type, then the representation might be done like this if we were to do it graphically. However, for continuous variation, we tend to use our histograms, and we have to put our ranges or various things that we're measuring in ranges. So you might have, say for example, a height category in centimeters, one that goes from 0 to 129. Then you might have another one that is 130 to 134. Then you might have another that goes straight up to over 176. So there are specific limitations, but you can't have one entity on our x-axis as we had for our discontinuous. So let's look at a few of these, and we're going to do this together. We're going to need to classify some of these characteristics as continuous or discontinuous. So let's go. The first one, gender. Is it continuous or discontinuous? All right, so for gender, or to be politically correct, someone might say biological, we say sex. We might say you are either male or female depending on the sex chromosome that you inherit. So there's a distinct category, so we're saying it's discontinuous. For tongue rolling, which is also another common example. So this is where persons are able to roll their tongue or fold their tongue into awkward shapes. It is something that is not something that everyone can do. So it's either you can do it or you can't do it. Also discontinuous. For skin color, because of course there are different tones that we can get, this would be referred to as continuous, and it is definitely affected by our environment. So if we were to look at in plants, pod shape, so we have some peas. What is determined by the size of the pods? Is it going to be a particular length? Again, we don't know. At one stage it might be 1 centimeter, at another stage it might be 5. We don't know. So in this case, continuous. Foot length. Some persons might wear a size 8 shoes. Some might say it's 8.5. Again, you know, go straight up to 13 depending on your size. We definitely have too many categories, so continuous. Earlobes. Are your earlobes attached? Are they detached? Do you have a nice curved shaped earlobe? Is it just attached to your head? Is it something that can be affected by the environment? Not quite. It's really dependent on your genes, and in this case you can either have an attached or detached earlobe, so distinct categories, and we say that is discontinuous. What about fingerprint? Yeah, it's either you have a fingerprint of a particular shape or a particular pattern, so again, discontinuous. Your weight. Many persons know during the COVID time, you'll recognize that before the lockdown, you were going about, you know, in the hundreds, and then after the quarantine and everything, you recognize because you were stuck at home eating a lot, your weight has fluctuated, you gained a few pounds. So again, also determined by our environment. So in this case, weight is continuous. Our heart rate, also something that again is dependent on your activity. So you decide to run a few laps around the field, your heart rate might spike, versus if you were to sit down and do some yoga like what was in the session this morning. So in this case, heart rate is continuous. Shoe size, similar to foot length, so also continuous. What about leaf surface area? So again, we are measuring that. So that would be continuous. And for antibiotic resistance, it's either you have antibiotic resistance or you don't have antibiotic resistance. And that is also something that is determined by your genes, so it is discontinuous. Now, it is very imperative for us to note, students, that when it comes to, say, for example, for antibiotic resistance, in most, say, unicellular organisms that are able to produce asexually, whereby they just one parent divides to give you two. So you recognize that there's not much difference between the genetic information. In this case, we're referring to antibiotic resistance in the case of other organisms that show some amount of variation, not necessarily or unicellular organisms that don't show it. Why is genetic variation important? Why is it different, or why is it important to be different? And even though they were drilling it in us during Sunday school, and some persons like, why do I have to be different? Why do I have to stand out? What's the value of it? Two reasons that we're going to stress today. The first one is that variation allows some individual within a population to adapt to changes in the environment. So there are some alleles that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce, which then ensures the survival of the allele in the population. So take, for example, there might be an allele that is detrimental, so there could be malformed oxygen-carrying proteins, like in the case of sickle cell anemia, and in that case, it might be passed on to an organism. You can have other mutations that are even more detrimental or lethal, and in that case, they are passed on to an organism and they may die out. If, say, for example, we have a lethal gene that is being inherited from one parent to another, and it's passing down through several lines of generation, if there wasn't any variation that could eliminate or probably diminish the reoccurrence of such a gene in the gene pool, then say there's a disease that could or affects persons with that gene, then it would wipe out everyone in civilization. We have seen some of those movies where persons are immune to certain viruses, and in such a case, that's how variation arises and assists organisms to survive if there are changes. Now, within our local context, say for example, when you had plants that are affected by a particular pest, if it's a case where we have variations, then it means that not every organism or not all the plants might be affected by that same pest in our agricultural sector. Now, genetic variation is also advantageous because it enables some individuals and therefore a population to survive despite changes in the environment. So let's look at a common example. Now, it is said that for cheetahs, there is a low genetic diversity in the population. The population of wild cheetahs have a low variation, and as such, they tend to be threatened, be it by human predators or by various diseases. This low genetic diversity means that oftentimes these cheetahs are susceptible to various diseases. And if it's a case where there are lethal mutations within their gene pool, it passes on from parent to another, and as such, we only have 5% of cheetahs surviving to adulthood because that lethal gene is passing on. So you can understand why it is that we definitely have to ensure that variation is something that is present within our population, as humans, as any other organism, as plants. Now, we are going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will definitely continue with variation. If you have any questions, please make sure to send them into our various platforms. School Not Out. We'll be right back.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much.
Reduce your risk of viral illnesses like the flu and coronavirus. Wash your hands frequently with soap and water. Cover your nose and mouth when coughing with a tissue and dispose of it. Avoid close contact with anyone with a cold or flu-like symptoms. If you become ill, please visit your doctor or the nearest health center and share your travel history. The flu and coronavirus can kill. Let's protect each other. A message from the Ministry of Health and Wellness.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much for watching.
COVID-19 tip. Protect yourself and others from getting sick by washing your hands after coughing or sneezing, when caring for the sick, before, during, and after you prepare food, before eating, after toilet use, when hands are visibly dirty, and after handling animals or animal waste.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here.
Get moving! Home workout series with Jamaica Moves.
Jamaica move, mobilize, exercise. Jamaica move, Jamaica move, Jamaica move, mobilize, exercise. Come on, take a selfie, breathe.
Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8:35 a.m.
Hi! We haven't left you out. It's Get Moving Kids.
Wall Street above, we're moving.
Home workout series with Jamaica Moves. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 2 p.m. on TVJ.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you.
Welcome to Schools Not Out, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE subjects. Now, before the break, we were looking on variation. We defined what is variation. We were able to look on the types of variation, and we were highlighting why variation is important. Now we're going to move on to our final topic, which is speciation. And speciation is a study or the formation of new species. Now remember, from our basics in ecology, we have kingdoms. All organisms are divided into kingdoms. Kingdoms are further divided into phylums or phylum. A phylum is divided into a class into a order, order into family, and family into a genus, and genus into species. So for speciation, we're studying that whole aspect of species. So what is a species? Species are organisms of a population that are able to breed freely or interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So for a scientific terminology or biological definition of species, organisms that are able to interbreed to produce fertile and viable offspring. Let's take, for example, in the case of canines. For the species of canines, you could have different species. So wolves would fall under that. We could have fox. We could have even our very own domestic dogs. All of these are different species of canines. We find it also in plants as well. Now, persons will say, all right, are you sure they have to be able to produce fertile offspring? Let's look at some example. Well, one example that shows the incompatibility when we mix two organisms that are of a different species. And this is something that is similar to or be known to our context. So take, for example, we have our horse. Our horse has a total of 64 chromosomes on a natural basis, and the horse would have, the sex cells would have 32 chromosomes. If the horse was made to mate with a donkey that has 62 chromosomes and the haploid number of chromosomes being 32, what is produced in this crossbreeding would be a mule. And as many persons will know, for mules, they are infertile. So if we were to get two mules to, say, for example, procreate, the post-zygotic mechanism would depict that two mules cannot have an offspring because, again, they were produced from a horse and a donkey that were not from the same species. So you see the definition coming into play. Species, organism that are able to interbreed to produce viable offsprings that are fertile. So how are new species formed? They could be formed from geographic isolation, and this is one of the most common examples. So there could be physical barriers that, say, a river is now separating birds or that were on one island, one area of an island from another, and over a period of time recognize that there are changes. There could be selective pressure as well in regards to other ecological factors such as predator-prey relationships based on the geographic location that would have resulted in the organisms changing over a period of time. Another way of forming species could be reproductive isolation, and these are factors that impede mating and fertilization. So quickly, we'll see habitat isolation, where they don't live in the same space. We have temporal isolation, where they breed at different times of the year. Behavioral isolation, where there are barriers to courtship. So the male is sending out the signals, but the female is not receptive. You can have mechanical isolation, where there are anatomical incompatibilities, so they're not able to procreate or copulate. And then, of course, you could have gametic isolation, where the mating occurs, but the gametes do not fuse to form a viable zygote. So let's look at some quick questions to concretize the concepts that we covered today. The first one says, which of the following is a discontinuous variation? Remember, discontinuous, there are distinct categories. So for foot size, not so much. Intelligence, if we're measuring intelligence based on IQ, not really. The presence of horn or absence is either you have it or you don't. And for height, there are too many categories to take into consideration. So our ideal answer in this case would be C. Genetic variation is important because, our second question, why is it important? Because it allows for survival against diseases, and that was one that we highlighted within our example. This is also another past paper question. We have two graphs, and we have graph X and graph Y, and it says graph X shows or could show what? It could show the height of students in a school, because we recognize that it's a histogram, and for the histograms, we tend to use that for continuous variation. All the others are discontinuous. And for our final question, we say X and Y can be used to show what? What are we using these graphs to show in biology? We're using them to show variation. So students, this was our final topic that we're going to do in regards to genetics. But I will encourage you to make sure that, of course, you're reading on a day-to-day basis, and you make sure that you're going based on your syllabus. The next thing that would have been done would have been genetic engineering. So, and that's something that you can watch some YouTube videos, you can definitely read your literature, read your text. Make sure you revise those key concepts that you've covered over the years of your entire CSEC stint, and make sure that you practice your past paper questions. We know the answer until we're in an exam. So don't take anything for granted, cover all your bases. Also remember to pay attention to those key things that you would have done for your labs, because they could also come up. Please remember, stay safe. Sanitize, social distancing. Remember to test your temperature when we're in our regular environment. Remember to wear your mask. And in all things, remember that you have the potential to be great and be your own individual. That's it for this lesson. You can catch a repeat of today's lesson on GNN later at 4 p.m. in Schools Not Out, and in the Schools Not Out highlights on Saturday between 1 and 4 p.m. It is also on video on demand on onespotmedia.com. For CSEC Biology, I'm Pierce Lawrence. Thank you so much for making the program. Be safe. Continue safe viewing.
Hi there, I'm Simon Preston from TVJ. Thank you very much for watching our YouTube channel. To see our latest videos and also to see live events, click here. To see our full videos on onespotmedia.com, click here. Thank you very much.
Reduce your risk of viral illnesses like the flu and coronavirus. Wash your hands frequently with soap and water. Cover your nose and mouth when